Hi, I'm Gerald from Kummara.
And I'm Shelley Wall from Infinity Community Solutions.
I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today and elders past, present and emerging.
I'd like to acknowledge the wonderful partnership between Kummara and Infinity KICS and Queensland Foster and Kinship Care, who are working together to bring this wonderful series of supportive webinars for the benefit of foster and kinship carers, this one being on permanency. We really hope you enjoy it.
My name's Carissa Inglis from Queensland Foster and Kinship Care. I'm the Service Support Manager and I have been working for QFKC for the past 16 years. One of my passions, and that of everyone that works at QFKC, is the importance of achieving permanency for our children and young people in alternate care in Queensland. Today I will be joined by two guest speakers from Kummara and Infinity and look forward to presenting this topic to you today. So the content that we're going to look at today is what is permanency. We're going to look at a bit of history in respect to permanency to help us understand why and how we've come to where we are today in Queensland. We're going to talk about the changes to legislation, a lot of which occurred in 2018, which is a driving force behind how we do permanency today. We're going to look at cultural considerations in respect to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and what we need to think about in respect to permanency decision making. And in that section we will be helped and guided by Kummara. We are going to talk about what you should expect if you want to be a guardian for a child or young person in alternate care. What does that mean for you? What does that mean for the children? And obviously for all the significant people surrounding that child. We're going to look at the process for determining suitability. So what are the processes that child safety actually go through to process whether a person is suitable as a guardian? And then we're going to look at the Children's Court and carer participation. So the Children's Court are ultimately the decision makers in respect to applications for permanency. We'll also look at review rights as well. So what's really, really important for people to understand is that permanency for children and young people is not about being in care long term. Permanency for children and young people is about their right to feel connected in a long-term, permanent living environment. And that could be with their mother, it could be with their father, it could be with family members, it could be with a foster or kinship carer. So it's important to understand that it's not just a child remaining in care outside a family or away from their birth parents long term. What I like to think about when I think about permanency is that it's one of my favourite sayings, and if you've heard me train before, then you've definitely heard me say this. It's a quote from Bronfman Brunner, who's a developmental psychologist, and what he says is that every child has the right to have someone that's irrationally crazy about them. And it's that irrational, crazy person that we want making the decisions for our children and young people long term. Like I said, that could be their mum and dad if they're able to achieve the case plan goals and have their child reunified to them, or it could be a family member, or it could be a foster carer. So when we look at permanency and how the department look at that, they also, like I said, reunification and then long-term alternate care, which is family-based, or adoption. So child safety have a permanency continuum, which helps us to have a visual in respect to what permanency should look like for a child or young person. When a child and young person comes into care, what the department must do, and we'll explore this as we go through, is that they must work towards having that child reunified. We have 11,000 children approximately in the alternate care system here in Queensland at the moment, and we just don't have the capacity to continue to have children in alternate care system. We need to do what we can to reunify children to parents that are able to provide a safe and caring environment for them. And it's only those children that are not able to be reunified safely to their mums and their dads or to their family where we should be looking at long-term alternate care options in care. So keeping a child safe at home is what we want to achieve primarily. And then if we can't and we need to bring a child into care, then our primary focus needs to be reunification. If we are not able to reunify a child, we need to look at long-term permanent care. And the long-term permanent care options that we're going to explore today is kin, foster care, adoption, or guardianship to the chief executive. And what we're going to do today is really look at in what order should that be considered. So I'm going to talk about the dimensions of permanency. These dimensions were actually introduced as a result of the Kummara inquiry in 2018. And we're going to do a lot of discussion in respect to these three dimensions because they really are the backbone in terms of what we should be thinking about when we are considering permanency in any form. So relational permanency is the experience of having positive, loving, trusting and nurturing relationships with significant others, parents, friends, siblings, family and carers, and not to feel any clashes of loyalty. So what's really interesting to understand is that these dimensions of permanency were actually introduced into the Child Protection Act in 2018. And for the first time, carers were actually mentioned as being a significant other and recognising the importance of children and young people continuing to have relationships with carers, even if they're not placed with them, because that is a significant relationship that they've formed some form of attachment to. Depending on how long they've been in the placement, that person has had a significant impact on that child, and the importance of children having those continued relationships throughout their lives is recognised in these dimensions of permanency. Then we talk about physical permanency, which is those stable living arrangements and connections with the child's community until they achieve independence. And again, we're going to explore that in a whole lot more depth as we go on today. And legal permanency. So for all concerned to behave as if the child is a family member, legal arrangements associated with permanency. So essentially, we need the right people making decisions for our children and young people who are in long-term care. Those guardian decisions are really, really important, and there's lots of day-to-day decisions that only guardians can make. So we want the right people making those decisions long-term for a child. So what these dimensions of permanency tell us is that having all three of them is when a child achieves permanency in its true sense. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the history and where we've come to in Queensland relating to permanency. So we don't actually have a particularly good track record here in Queensland. And certainly the Kummara inquiry and various other inquiries have really highlighted that we in Queensland have allowed children in many instances to remain in drift. And what that means is there was just short-term order after short-term order with no concurrent planning and no actual plan for that child to achieve permanency. And the sense of feeling permanency for a child or young person is so incredibly important because it's about what they think is going to happen the next day and the day after that and the day after that. Those feelings of security and stability are certainly really, really important in terms of a child's overall safety and well-being. So, like I said, this was very much raised in the Kummara inquiry, which was completed in 2012 in Queensland. And this is a quote from the Commission is concerned at the high number of children and young people subject to multiple short-term orders because this could indicate that many children are drifting in care without achieving either reunification with the family or long-term out-of-home care. And I think one of the reasons why I'm super passionate about permanency is because my background is in child protection in New Zealand. I moved over to Queensland in 2005. And prior to coming over to Queensland, I worked for Child Safety in New Zealand. And even back then, so we're talking almost 20 years ago, New Zealand's child protection system, we had to have a plan A and a plan B that we would submit to the equivalent of the Children's Court. And that was about recognising the importance of our plan is to reunify this child, absolutely, but in the event that we're not able to reunify this child, what is our next plan? So we're not putting all our eggs in one basket, we're actually really considering what are the needs of this child long term and having a concurrent plan that reflects that. So it wasn't until 2018 that we actually achieved that in Queensland, where it was legislated that concurrent planning is a must, and we're going to talk about that as we go on as well. And that resulted in part from the Carmody inquiry really highlighting that actually we have so many children adrift on short-term order after short-term order after short-term order. Okay, so then Carmody made a number of recommendations as a result of that inquiry in relation to permanency, and these are what those recommendations say. So consideration to pursue adoption, particularly for children under 3 when reunification is no longer feasible. And I think that was, at the time, adoption was included into the Child Protection Act in 2018. There has been some amendments in November 2021 around adoption and the preference for adoption. And we're actually going to take a bit of a deep dive into that as well, so that carers can have a really clear understanding about the intention of the adoption and what that actually means and how it can be achieved, because it is certainly, although it's certainly a preference above for non-Aboriginal children, the Chief Executive having long-term guardianship, people must be aware of the complications or the difficulty in that order being granted. Recommendation 7.5 from Carmody talked about including cultural support plans for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, being a requirement that arrangements be made for regular contact with at least one person who shares the child's cultural background. So if a decision is being made to grant long-term guardianship to a suitable person, that we absolutely must have plans in place for that child to be connected to family and to community and to culture. And that is best achieved by actually evidencing what that person has done in the past. So it's not a matter of what they say they are going to do as a guardian. It would be about the department looking at what they have done throughout the course of the short-term order to support those connections to family and community and culture. And then recommendation 7.6 was to include in local family support needs plans, information on the different cultural and linguistic groups in the community, engage in consultation with those communities to determine what cultural support they can provide, and ensure frontline workers, foster and kinship carers, and non-government service providers are given appropriate cultural training, and that the cultural support plans specify arrangements for regular contact with at least one person who shares the child's cultural background. So some really strong recommendations from Carmody there around the need for that really purposeful planning for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children that ensures that they are connected to family, that they are connected to their culture, that they are connected to their community. So in summary, when we're talking about Carmody, and again, you know, that has really influenced what we have now in today's world around permanency, he really highlighted the need for permanency to be considered as more than just placement, and he spoke to that legislative framework that we spoke about before. So the relational, physical and legal permanency was raised by Carmody as well. And he really wanted the sector to consider that when we think about long-term care, we can't just say that a child is placed with this person over here and has been placed with them for 5 years, so they're in a long-term stable placement, because that actually isn't achieving permanency. Achieving permanency is recognising that that child has all those relationships surrounding them that are important to them, which continues to be their birth families and people of significance to them. It is about the physical permanency. So when I talk about physical permanency as we go on, again, it's about that stable living environment and about the physicality of the environment around them that is familiar to them and makes them feel safe and stable and secure. And then it's about that legal permanency, about the right people making those guardianship decisions. Okay, so then we had the legislative reform, which was really guided by the Kummara inquiry. So on the 29th of October 2018, the Queensland child protection sector witnessed significant reform take place. The key changes were in relation to these 4 areas, so permanency and safe care and connection, information sharing and transition to adulthood. And of course today we're actually looking at the permanency aspect. So we're going to have a look and take a much closer look at what those legislative changes meant in respect to permanency. So this gives you a really good overview in respect to the permanency changes and what that meant in the context of the Child Protection Act. And then what we're going to do today is we're actually going to explore each area of this in more depth to help carers in the sector have a much better understanding about each of those areas. So one of the there's lots of important changes, but certainly one of the paramount principle actually changed. So what it used to say pre-2018 is that the safety and well-being of a child was paramount. And what was inserted in 2018, which is really important, is saying that the safety, well-being and best interests of a child throughout childhood and for the rest of the child's life. And like I said, we're going to explore that as we go on. But I want you to keep that in the back of your mind there. And then, of course, what we've already spoken about and will continue to speak about today is that consideration of the relational, physical and legal aspects of permanency. And then the 5 elements of the child placement principle to be applied when working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people and families. And I'm going to have some assistance from Kummara today as guest speakers to really explore those 5 core principles in terms of what that actually means in regards to day-to-day care for children that are placed within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principle with family, and for those children that have not been able to be placed in accordance with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principle and are with non-family. So what is it that carers who are non-Aboriginal caring for Aboriginal children can do to meet those 5 core principles on a day-to-day basis? And concurrent planning, which we've already spoken about today. So the importance of concurrent planning. So remember, here we're looking at the legislative changes. So concurrent planning became a legislative requirement in 2018. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, the case plan must include details as to how the plan is consistent with the connection element of the child placement principles and permanent care order as a new type of child protection order. So we used to just have long-term guardianship to suitable other, but there was actually another order introduced in 2018, which is called a permanent care order. And what we're going to do towards the end of today's session is we've got a bit of a table to show you the difference between when the department has custody, when the department has guardianship, when a carer or family member has guardianship, and when a carer or family member has permanent guardianship. So that will assist you to understand what each of those orders mean and what fits under each of them. And then streamlining changes from one long-term order to another. So those are the main areas that we're going to talk about. Okay, so that 5BA, this was the insertion of 5BA, which is all around permanency. So principles for achieving permanency for a child. Now, if you look into the context, so this is what it reads in the Act, and if you look into the actual content of what is being read, it will now talk about physical, relational and legal permanency. So this is in the Act and it's under Section 5BA. So, ongoing positive, trusting and nurturing relationships with persons of significance to the child, including the child's parents, siblings, extended family members and carers. So that's your relational permanency. Then number B, stable living arrangements with connections to the child's community that meet the child's developmental, educational, emotional, health, intellectual and physical needs. So that's your physical permanency. And then when we move on, we have legal arrangements for the child's care that provide the child with a sense of permanence and long-term stability, including, for example, a long-term guardianship order, a permanent care order, or an adoption order for the child. So that's your legal permanency. So we're just going to have a little further explore into that relational, physical and legal permanency. And you've already heard me speak a lot about that already today, but I hope what that does is it highlights for you the importance of these three dimensions, and we should always be thinking about it when we're looking at a child within an out-of-home care placement. So when we're thinking about relational permanency, we're thinking about things such as relationships that are nurtured through natural, safe and appropriate settings, that they are child-centred, age and developmentally appropriate, that relationships are positive, nurturing and trusting, and that family, persons of significance, siblings, carers and community are considered persons of significance in that child's relational world. So those are all the things that we consider when we're thinking about relational permanency. Now let's have a look at physical. So that genuine connection to community. What I want you to think about is, for me, for example, we built our house in 2006 and we are still there, 2022. So my children have lived in the same home, they've attended the same schools, they have that same community around them. In fact, when my son went when we did up his bedroom when he became a teenager, I said to him, this is probably the closest you're going to feel to moving home with your bedroom looking different. What that does for a child though is, of course we can move homes and we can move locations, but it's really important that the child experiences connections that are similar to them, so that if they are going to move homes and they're going to go to a different community, a child such as my own would still have their family around them. So that although they may have lost some of that physical permanency because they've changed schools or they've changed their sporting clubs, or there's a whole range of things that have changed there, they still have their most, the people that mean the most to them, their family surrounding them. So they're able to make those transitions much easier. For some of our children and young people that experience multiple placements, what we need to think about is, particularly in areas such as South East and Brisbane and Moreton and all those areas where it may be that the child moves placement but they also move suburbs, is that not only do they lose that relational permanency in terms of the relationships that they've established with their carers, but they actually lose some of that physical permanency as well, because all those things that were familiar for them has actually changed as well. And if we have children that constantly are moving placement to placement, then the impact on them in terms of their relational and physical permanency is quite extreme. So when a child is coming into care, that's why the department really try to keep the child at the same school or try to keep them in the same sporting arrangements, or, that they're cutting off a lot of those not cutting them off, but they're removing a child from a lot of those relational permanency relationships. And so whilst contact will still be supported, the child actually needs to feel that sense of belonging through their community. And that's why the department always try to keep children within their community to achieve that physical permanency and to achieve that, continued connection to their home. Okay, so we've talked about physical permanency in respect to that genuine connection to family. So they have that consistent therapeutic and medical support. So going to the same doctor, seeing the same therapist, because those are really important connections there. Stable living arrangements, like I just spoke about. They experience stability at school. Children that go from school to school to school, every time they go to school, change school, their education is being disrupted, and when they go to a new school they're having to establish relationships, and that can really disrupt their learning, particularly if they're not having a pleasant experience in developing those relationships. Recognising also that our children have experienced trauma, so they're actually having to start a new school, they're having to deal with the trauma that has led to them coming into care, they're having to make new friendships, and they're having to, with all of that in the background, trying to engage their cortex to actually learn, and that can be almost an impossibility for some of our children and young people. So the importance of trying to keep a child at the same school, although that can be extremely frustrating for some carers that are having to travel long distances, when a child first moves to your home, to try and keep their schooling stable until we know that this placement is going to be much more long term and that the child has those relational permanency aspects, so they may be able to transition part of that physical aspect is much better. So the child is also able to maintain those extracurricular activities, and again that is super, super important for our children. If they were playing netball, if they were doing soccer, if they were swimming, if we can maintain that, because it's not just about the sport, but it's also about those friendships that they make within those sports as well. And then we have the legal. So legal arrangements that provide that sense of permanency, that when a child brings home that form from school that needs signing, that the carer can actually do that, and that they don't get anxious that some of those permission forms need to be signed off by their CSO and their CSO is really busy and may not get around to it. So the guardianship sits with the guardian who often knows the child best. The child and guardian sharing important life moments. The child feels their home is permanent. So particularly for children that have experienced a number of placements or instability in their life, when that legal permanency is achieved for them, it can provide them with such a sense of stability that actually I can trust now that this is real and that no one can take me away and that I'm safe and stable here. And the child is able to experience relationships through their community in a natural way. And what that means is that there's none of that red tape that is it has to be in place for our children and young people that are subject to child protection orders where the department are the guardian, because they're responsible for many children and they're responsible to make those decisions. Often that red tape can sometimes get in the way of children actually experiencing natural kind of experiences within the community. So if we think about high-risk activities, for example, and a child may have the opportunity to do something that is considered high risk in the moment, but the carer is not able to consent to that. That would require departmental consent as the guardian. That's not able to be achieved because it was the last moment thing, and so the child misses out on that. So when we actually achieve when we achieve legal permanency, what that means is obviously the carer who knows the child best is able to make those decisions and do that risk analysis themselves based on the knowledge that they have on the child and the circumstance, and will make that decision in the best interest of the child. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're actually going to introduce Angela from Kummara, and Angela will sit down with us and have a discussion about what all three of these relational, physical and legal aspects of permanency mean for our children and young people who identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. Hi Angela, thank you for joining us today on this Achieving Permanency webinar. We're very lucky to have you and your input. So Angela, you work for Kummara?
Yes, I work for Kummara and Infinity Community Solutions.
Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, so before we begin, I'd like to do an acknowledgement to country. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we are on today, which is the Yagara and Turrbal people. I'd like to acknowledge our elders, past, present and emerging. And definitely acknowledge all of our carers. I'm a proud Marooney woman from the Gorang Nation. On my mum's side and on my dad's side, we have ties with the Noongar people of the Quandamooka Nation.
Thank you, Angela. And how long have you worked for Kummara and Infinity for? And tell me a bit about your background in child protection.
Okay, so I started working with Kummara 2014, and I've worked as a family support worker, and then I came across when Kummara and Infinity Community Solutions formed a partnership for the Kinship and Foster Care program. Yeah. So I've been in this position just over 2 years. So.
Wonderful. And the topic that we're going to talk about today, achieving permanency. So, we have a view that, all children and young people have the right to achieve permanency and to feel a sense of connection to people of significance to them. And we really wanted to talk to you today, Angela, about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, and you know the really important considerations that we need to think about when we are looking at decisions relating to permanent care for them. So thank you for being part of these discussions today. We're just going to start. We've had a conversation around relational, physical and legal permanency and the importance of that, generally speaking. I really want you to chat to me about the importance of relational permanency for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And I guess firstly, if we can just start with, when we have an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child that has been able to be placed within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principle, that is, they're placed with family, what would relational permanency look like and feel like for a child that has been able to be placed within that placement principle?
I think, it is a more natural relationship. They already have that connection with their family. They've already have a relationship with their family. So they are supported 100% when it comes to meeting the children's needs in line with the placement principles.
And so I would imagine for a child that is placed with family, then those connections, like you said, would just happen naturally. That you know, they don't need to be guided so much by the department. That you know, family interactions at any family events, it would just be a natural occurrence, and so that child would have that sense of relational permanency. So what about, Angela, in the event that a child is not placed in accordance with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander principle, so if they're with a non-Aboriginal carer, what impact could that have on a child's relational permanency?
If the young person did not have any connection with any family or their culture or their community, it would have a big impact on their well-being. So if placed with a non-Indigenous carers, it would be imperative for the carers to work to include their culture in their everyday living. And then hopefully, you know, with child safety, that they refer this young person's case to for kin mapping to be done, where there's genuine efforts to locate family and the community, and so for them to have that connection continuously.
Okay, so I'm a non-Aboriginal person and I'm caring for an Aboriginal child. I would expect that I would not just be expected to connect that child to mum and dad, but there would be a whole range of other people I would need to connect that child to as well. Is that the case?
In the case with our carers, we're an Indigenous kinship and foster care agency as it is, so the majority of our workers are Indigenous. So, you know, quite a lot of the workers have connections with the community as it is. So we utilise that avenue as well. We do the kin mapping. Our organisation actually has a kin mapping program as well. So, and now some of the service centres have a kin mapping unit in the service centres as well. And definitely speaking, trying to locate families and finding out their history on where the family are from and where they have ties and their connections.
So overall, when we think about relational permanency, obviously if a child's placed within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principle, that relational permanency will come much more naturally. If they're with a non-Aboriginal carer, outside of an organisation such as Kummara, being supported by an agency that is not an Aboriginal Foster and Kinship Care service, there would need to be much more concerted and intentional efforts from the carer to ensure that that child is connected to family, and an expectation that that's not just mum and dad, but a whole range of community, family members. Wonderful.
I I would look to refer the young person to any of our cultural programs with our community controlled organisations.
Yeah.
And, you know, working one-on-one to find a worker, work one-on-one with these young people around cultural education and teachings. There is some cultural programs in a lot of our services,
Yeah.
so that the children could participate in.
And I imagine that there'd be services statewide, and
Yes,
that's a really
yes.
important point, isn't it, Angela? Because it's not up to a non-Aboriginal carer to be teaching child culture.
No.
That is up to the community and to the
Yes.
family to be doing that. So
Yes.
the carer's role in that
Yep.
is to actually ensure that that child has links to those.
Yeah, have to follow cultural protocol,
Yeah.
and it has to be done correctly.
Yes.
Like, for instance, you know, the teachings, if the child was a young male, would have to come from a male person to teach them, and the same with a young girl.
Yes. And that really leads us into the next aspect, which is physical permanency. And so that's all about, you know, a child feeling connected to their actual physical environment. And that's really important for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, isn't it? Because that's their country.
Yes.
So talk to me about the impact on an Aboriginal child if we were to take them off country and place them elsewhere.
Sadly, most of our children are not where their ties are in their country anyway.
Yeah.
So it's can be very successful in locating family. They don't necessarily always live on country, but they do go back to country, and they still have those connections and ties there, you know. So
Yeah.
and they're still taught about their culture from their family members that are still on country.
And that's actually now supported under the Human Rights Act. A child to, you know, any child that identifies as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander has the right to be connected to their country. And so, you know, like you said, if the department, if a child is not on country, then the department has a responsibility alongside the carers to ensure that that is facilitated.
Oh, it's imperative for their sense of belonging and for them to get to know about their culture and their family, you know, to start their healing processes. Yeah.
So when we talk about legal permanency, or that, you know, that's obviously the right people making the right decisions. And of course, for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, our preference is to family to be guardians and making those decisions. So at the time of writing or doing this presentation, there was 611 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children that were subject to long-term guardianship orders to suitable others, out of 3,322. So what that tells us is that there's a huge amount of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children that are subject to long-term guardianship orders to the Chief Executive. And I want to talk to you, Angela, about the importance of the department, you know, completing assessments on family where, you know, we have Aboriginal children placed with family so that they may be considered to be suitable persons, and then the right people are making the right decisions. So in the event that we're not able to place in accordance with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principle, but we have a carer, for example, that is working with family, that is connected with the family through ensuring that the child has that physical and relational permanency. In your view, would the family be more willing, I guess, to support a decision for a non-Aboriginal carer to have guardianship if they can see that their child is being raised in accordance with their culture, community, and, you know, where they feel part of that?
I believe that for the community, this would be the last situation that we'd like our children to be in. And maybe if the carers have worked alongside the family and have had the support from the family, and it would have to be over quite a period of time, so that there is evidence that they support all contact for family, siblings, and for their culture. I'd say that, yeah, that the family would support them.
But like you said, the most critical element of that is what have they done in the past to show. It's not
Yes.
about what they will do, it's about what they have done. And only then will a family potentially feel comfortable.
Yeah, and a family believe they're willing and they will continue to support those connections for our kids.
Yeah,
that they,
absolutely. Yeah. And then you may have situations, Angela, and I can think of a couple of situations, but let's say that you might have grandparents that are not in a position to care for their grandchildren because they're just not physically able to. But by the department having long-term guardianship, they're still able, and the department are referring those guardianship decisions to them, they still have, in essence, those guardianship kind of decisions and the authority to make those decisions. And in those instances, it may not be appropriate to support long-term guardianship to a carer, because by doing that, it would take that decision making off the grandparents.
I don't think those decisions would be made lightly.
Yeah.
I'm aware of a case where a young person was not with their family, but they had the support of their family and that community for the carers to have the child in the long-term care with them.
And that would have been one of the department's considerations when supporting the long-term guardianship to a suitable person, is that the family and the community supported that too.
Yeah, and they had the support from the there's significant people in his family in the community.
So I want to thank Angela for really allowing us to explore those concepts with her, and that's really important. What we know with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children is that they are overrepresented in the alternate care system here in Queensland, and so unfortunately there will be situations where we're not able to place with family or community or other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander carers, and there will be children that are placed with non-Aboriginal carers. And what we need to do in those instances is we need to ensure that our non-Aboriginal carers caring for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children have the skill set and the tools and the knowledge and the understanding to provide the best type of care that they can, which actually supports that child and young person's connection to their culture, to their community, to their family, in line with those 5 core principles to achieve relational, physical and legal permanency. I spoke to you before about the paramount principle and one of the changes in the Act in relation to this, and that was about bringing in, not only do we need to consider what's in the best interest of the child now, but for the rest of the child's life. So what that means is that the department, when they are making any decision, that they have to consider, what is this decision going to mean for this child when they're an adult? When they are 40 years old, when they are 50 years old. And that was never a consideration before 2018 in accordance with the Act. It may have been consideration for practitioners day to day, but until it was legislated, that practitioners weren't needing to bring their mind to that from a legislative point of view, but they do now. So the Act outlines that the main principle, that is safety, wellbeing and best interest of the child, both through childhood and for the rest of their life, can be achieved by having a focus on permanency in terms of relational, physical and legal. There's those 3 terms again. Preference in achieving these are also listed as being, firstly, for the child to be cared for by family or a member of the child's family, if not a parent or another suitable person, and as a last option under the guardianship of the Chief Executive. So, what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to introduce Mel, and Mel is one of our workers within the Infinity Fostering Program, and we're going to talk with Mel about the implications for making those decisions, what the department must consider when they're thinking about the paramountcy principle and having discussions around what it means to think about a decision in the context of those considerations around for the rest of the child's life. And Mel is going to provide some examples of where that consideration has come into place in her day-to-day work. So we're just going to hand it over to Mel and have that discussion now. Hi Mel, welcome and thank you for being part of this webinar series today on achieving permanency. You're the manager for Kummara and Infinity. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name's Melanie, and as you said, I'm the manager here at Kummara and Infinity Community Solutions, or KICS. We work with kinship carers mainly and Indigenous carers to support them in their role of caring for children. I've been in child protection for 16, 17 years, and I wouldn't want to be anywhere else.
And you're also a foster carer?
I am. I started out as a general carer, but we do respite for the same children, and have done for over 10 years, and now we have been recognised as kin for them. So.
Wow, so not only do you understand child protection from a professional point of view, but you also, obviously from that personal experience, being a carer yourself.
Absolutely, so I can really empathise with some of the barriers that carers face.
Of course. Thank you for taking part in today. So we've had a discussion about the importance of physical and relational and legal permanency, and how important those are to achieve for our children and young people, and that one of the things in relation to that is also around the decisions that we make for children have to be the right decision not only now but for the rest of the child's life. And quite often we've also seen some statistics that we have over 7,000 children on long-term orders, but only about 1,600 of those are long-term guardianship to CE. So we may have achieved relational permanency and physical permanency for those children, but in those instances where we don't achieve legal permanency, so we haven't achieved permanency in its true sense. Look, you've been working in the industry for a long time, so you would have seen lots of those situations. Talk to us about what some of the implications can be for our foster and kinship care families where we've achieved relational permanency, we've achieved physical permanency, but we haven't achieved legal permanency.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Carissa. The biggest implication I see for the families is that it keeps reminding them that they're part of a system and not part of a family. What we see day to day is the impact on family holidays.
Yep.
I've seen many examples of families not being able to get the approval that they need in time, even with years of notice, and the family either goes on holiday without the child in care or they don't do the holiday at all. This can result in so many hurt feelings towards the system, towards workers, and sometimes towards each other. So I've actually seen some families break down because the impact of not going on that holiday was so much.
And I can imagine for the children themselves having that sense of someone else making those important decisions for them, that, you know, they could have 9 different CSOs throughout their lifetime, and so in their view that's 9 different people making those really important decisions. It would have an impact on the child or young person as well.
They really feel left out. Often they don't know their CSOs well, so trying to put their point across about why this is important to them doesn't happen. And actually, you know, CSOs don't often ask the child their thoughts about those decisions. It's a carer, worker decision. Yeah, left out, guilty.
Yeah. So there's a reason, isn't there, when we look at the Child Protection Act and we have those order of preferences as to, you know, who should have guardianship. It's the family, and then if not able to be mum or dad, then of course it needs to be another family member or a suitable person. And then for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, then it should be the chief executive, so as a third option. And for our non-Aboriginal children, adoption is the third option. And those preferences are there for a reason, because the person making those legal decisions for a child has an impact on day-to-day families.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so as you can see, that consideration in terms of not only thinking about what is in the best interests of a child now, but for the rest of the child's life is so super important, because it absolutely will and can have an effect on those decisions. Another example around there is if you have a 2-year-old child that has been placed with a carer for the first 2 years of their life, and then a family member becomes available to care for that child, and it's likely that that child will be in long-term care. Often, we have carers that rightfully, are upset about a child moving after they've provided care for them for 2 years, and they consider the attachment that has been formed between the carer and the child, and often extended family members of the carer, and a whole range of other relationships there. But when we apply the paramountcy principle to that, what we're saying is that a manager of a service centre can't just think about that attachment. They can't just think about the impact of the decision to move that child on that child right now. What they need to bring their mind to is that the impact of that decision on the child for the rest of their life. And when thinking about that, what we know and what research tells us is that when children have the opportunity to be raised with family, in family, then their life outcomes are likely to be better. And because it's those life-enduring relationships, we can't just consider a child's journey up until they're 18. We must consider their journey post-18. And if we're able to connect that child to be raised with family, then those relationships that they're going to have post-18 with aunties, uncles, family, that are going to be achieved naturally through those years that they are potentially on a long-term order subject to the chief executive or potentially to the carer, absolutely much more chance of that child is establishing those relationships in a much more natural way, and then having those relationships long term, and as we know, then feeling more connected and having better life outcomes as a result of that. So that's an example of how the department would use that paramount principle to, in respect to guiding their decisions. Okay, so we're going to go back to section 5BA now, which again, remember, is about the permanency principle. And in that permanency principle, it actually now provides the sequence or the preference of what order should be made when. So the first preference is for the child to be cared for by the by the child's family. So that is what the department wants to achieve for our children and young people. They want them to be cared for by their family. The second preference is for the child to be cared for under the guardianship of a person who is firstly a member of the child's family in the first instance, and if it can't be a member of the child's family, then another suitable person, which of course would be a foster carer. Now, if the child is not an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander child, the next preference is for the child to be adopted. The next preference for a non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child is for guardianship to the chief executive. The last preference for a child who is non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander is for long-term guardianship to the chief executive. The last preference for an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander child is for adoption. So those are preferences that were updated in November 2021, where adoption was actually inserted into those preferences. So prior to 2021, there was absolutely the Act enabled adoption to take place, but from November 2021, adoptions were actually inserted into the preferences. And so what those preferences mean is that when we are thinking about long-term care for a child or young person, the one that we want to happen first is we want for the child to be cared for by mum or dad. So we want them to be reunified. We want them to be safely cared for in their home with their mum and dad. The second preference is obviously, like I said, so if it can't be with mum and dad, then obviously we want the child or young person to be with a family member on a long-term order so that they are the guardian. The third is that if it can't be a family member, then it should be a foster carer. And so on and so forth. So we're going to explore that a little bit further. But first, we're actually going to explore adoption, because what QFKC found is that there was some confusion in the carer community about, well, if adoption is a preferred option above long-term guardianship to the chief executive, then why can't I adopt this child? Now, I also want to highlight at this point, because I think it's interesting and it's information that's really important, is that when Carmody did his inquiry many years ago, already at that time, long-term guardianship to the chief executive was the least preferred option. And the reason it's the least preferred option is because the state recognises that if a child can be cared for long-term by a member of their family or by a suitable person who's making those guardianship decisions for them, then that will be in their best interest. So only as a last option should the chief executive be that guardian for that child making all those important decisions. However, despite what the Act said pre-2018, we still had around about 75-80% of long-term guardianship orders to the chief executive. So Carmody was a little bit confused by that, and there was an audit done as part of his recommendations after the Carmody inquiry to really explore why there were so many long-term guardianship orders to the chief executive, and was there opportunity within those children, with those children and people that were subject to long-term guardianship to the chief executive to either be returned home or to go on to a long-term guardianship to suitable other order to a family member or to a foster carer. I have some stats here for September 2021, and there were 7,398 orders in total of long-term guardianship orders, and unfortunately only 1,603 of those were to a suitable other. So we are still in a place where the vast majority of orders are going to the last preference, which is obviously to the chief executive. And I think in order to change that, we need to better understand the process. What happens, like if you are a carer and a family member or a foster carer and you have a child in your care long term and you think you're a suitable person, what this training will do later on is actually provide guidance to you as to what you need to do to approach the service centre to actually undertake that process. But in order to do that also, we need to come back and help carers understand why adoption is not considered very often in this space, and that it's not an order that can be made under the Child Protection Act, it's an order that is made under the Adoptions Act. So let's explore that a bit further. So, whilst the third preference for non-Aboriginal children and the last preference for Aboriginal children for permanency has been identified by adoption, adoption is not facilitated under that Child Protection Act, which I just said. Rather, it's under the 2009 Adoption Acts. So if a parent are not consenting to adoption, a children's magistrate will have to make an order that dispense the need to consent. And that is pretty significant because that is taking away a parent's right to continue to have a relationship potentially with their child. And, you know, obviously we don't have a very good history in Queensland historically around forced adoption, the stolen generation. And so whenever we're asking a magistrate to actually dispense a parent's permission to adopt or consent, then, you know, we need to have extremely good grounds to do that. So we're going to talk about possibly some of those grounds today. So number 2, carer will be invited to be assessed as a suitable adoptive parent for the child under Section 89 of the Adoptions Act, only where child safety have case planned and identified adoption as in the best interest of the child and a matter of consent has been finalised. So this has to happen first before the department will even engage in a conversation with a carer around potential adoption. And what's important there is what you've read there is that the foster carer will actually have to be assessed as a suitable adoptive parent. So it's not just about being approved as a foster carer, you actually have to be approved as a suitable adoptive parent. And what we know is that the requirements to be an adoptive parent and the requirements to be a foster parent are very different and the assessment looks very different. So you may be considered a suitable foster carer and meet the requirements to be a foster carer, but you may not actually meet the requirements under the Adoptions Act to be an adoptive parent. And like I said, you'll need to go through that assessment process. So this is what I want you to consider here when we think about adoption as well, because we need to go back to the Child Protection Act and one of the principles within the Child Protection Act. And what that principle says is that in protecting a child, the state should only take action that is warranted under the circumstances. And that's really important, because when an adoption order is made for a child, essentially what that means is that we're ripping up their birth certificate and issuing them with a new birth certificate. And that is really drastic action to be taken, because that does not align with some of the other principles of the Child Protection Act, the Statement of Standards, the Human Rights Act, the Charter of Rights, which is about a child's right to remain connected to family. Siblings, often lots of our children in care have a number of siblings and they're not necessarily placed with those siblings. So actually ripping up a child's birth certificate and issuing them with a new one could have the effect of them being really displaced from their family of origin, including their siblings. So this principle highlights the need to take the least intrusive means of intervention needed in order to achieve safety and wellbeing for a child. So permanency can be achieved for a child through a long-term guardianship to suitable person or a PCO, and these orders do not require a child to be issued with a new birth certificate. So what a magistrate would be thinking is, well, why do I need to dispense a parent's consent to adopt when I can over here, still grant a long-term guardianship order or a permanent care order, which would give the goal of meeting permanency for that child without having that drastic action of having to, rip up that birth certificate, like I said. And that fits with the principle 5BE, which I just spoke about. So PCO orders and LTG orders also require the guardian to maintain relationships between the child and their family to ensure identity is maintained now and for the rest of the child's life. And like I said, that fits with all of those areas of the Statement of Standards and the Charter of Rights and the Human Rights Act that we're all bound by in the sector when working with children and young people. So the effect of adoption is to sever those legal relationships, and therefore this option will only ever be suitable for a very small cohort of children. And so when speaking with the department and considering what those small cohorts of children could be, it could be, for example, a child that was abandoned at birth and where family has not been able to be located for that child. So actually there's not going to have the effect of displacing them from family because family hasn't been able to be identified. So that's one example of where adoption may be suitable for a child, but it's going to only be for a small cohort of children. So when a parent consents to an adoption, what's also important to understand is that there is no provision for the parent to consent to a particular person to adopt their child. So if you're a carer and you're talking to a parent and you're saying to them that you would like to adopt their child and you convince them to go down that path, when they consent to that adoption, they're not consenting for you to adopt their child, they're consenting for their child to go up for adoption. And for our young children in care, that may have the effect of once that child is up for adoption, then it's up to the adoptions department to actually look at their suitable register, and they may actually consider that there is a more appropriate adoptive person, suitable person to actually adopt that child. So that's something really important to consider as well. And you need to consider also that you may not be deemed a suitable adoptive parent at all. So you might go through that assessment process and not be considered suitable to adopt, and yet we still have a child up for adoption. And in that case, that child will be placed with a different adoptive parent. So one of the other things that is really important to understand is that consent for adoption needs to be voluntary and informed. So if a parent stops engaging during the pre-adoption and counselling process, adoptions will not keep trying to engage a parent. So that's also important to keep in mind. Okay, so hopefully that has cleared up any lack of understanding around how adoption works. It's now, obviously within our Child Protection Act as a preferred option that sits even above for non-Aboriginal children long-term guardianship to the CE, but it's really important to have an understanding of the context that surrounds that it's not just as easy as making and adopting that child through the Child Protection Act, that there is a process that takes place under the Adoptions Act. All right, now we're going to talk about concurrent planning. So we've spoken about concurrent planning at the beginning. I've spoken to you about my passion relating to concurrent planning. And can I just say here also that the Statement of Commitment, which we did our first webinar in partnership with Kummara and Infinity on, has a section on concurrent planning. So QFKC really supported the introduction in the Statement of Commitment, that was the most recent one in 2020, of the importance of the department actually engaging in conversations with carers around what is the concurrent plan for the child or young person that they're providing care for. So as a carer, if you don't know what the concurrent plan is for the child or young person in your care, you should know. And so have a discussion with your CSO about that and find out what the concurrent plan is. So if the primary goal is to reunify the child to a parent or parents, an alternate goal must be in place in the event that timely reunification of the child to the care of the parents is not possible. Now we're going to go back and have a chat with Angela about this, because what's super important here is that we need to understand that when the department, particularly in those early days, if they've just removed a child and placed them, then sometimes they have not been able to locate family. And so we're going to have a chat to Angela about the importance of what's going on behind the scenes with concurrent planning in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And I also want to highlight for all children, family mapping is absolutely essential. As a foster carer, if you have a child placed with you in those early days of a placement, you should have an understanding that what the department should be doing behind the scenes is actually really exploring family options. Angela, I want to talk to you about case planning, and we've talked a little bit about this early on, and you mentioned the importance of family mapping.
Yes.
And so when the department place a child initially, that can be in a really emergent situation. They may have tried to find family to start with, but if they're needing to remove a child immediately, then we may have a situation where a child is not placed in accordance with the placement principle. You spoke earlier about family mapping. Talk to me about the importance of that when children have not been placed in accordance with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principle. What should be happening behind the scenes?
So previous practice, the child was just removed and that was it.
Yeah.
So now I believe that child safety are having those conversations with the parents and say, do you have anyone that you would consider the children staying within within your family, and can you give us much information about your family members?
Yeah.
So that is happening now, which never happened before, which is really good.
Yeah.
So then each child will have a genogram attached to their case.
Yeah, and we're doing that concurrent planning that, you know, at all times, the department, if the child's not placed in accordance with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principle, that in the background, carers should be expecting that the department are doing family mapping to locate family so that a child can be placed in accordance with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander principle. And then we talked before, didn't we, about that relational, physical and legal permanency. And then so if we are able to place in accordance with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principle, then we can be assured that those dimensions of permanency will be achieved much easier for children. Wonderful.
And that all of them are addressed and met, hopefully. So,
absolutely. So I want to thank Angela for, really having a conversation with us about the importance of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principle, and really highlighting that even if we're not able to place within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principle at the time of removal, that does not mean that the department should not be doing some work to actually work towards having a child placed within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principle within community, with family. Okay, so concurrent planning is about those two stimulus plans, and like I said before, it's that plan A and plan B working alongside each other. So there should be no surprises for anyone. And, you know, talking to kin out there, I know it can be really hard because, you know, when you initially get that phone call to say, look, can you have your grandchild? It's only going to be for a few weeks or a few months or a year. You put all your expectation into this place of, you know, this is only for this period of time, I can manage this. And that's where, unfortunately, if we don't have those concurrent planning discussions, we set up kinship carers and foster carers to have expectations that are unrealistic. We actually need to be having those conversations at the time of the placement with our kin and with other foster carers about this is what we hope. We hope that mum and dad are going to be able to achieve reunification. We hope that the children can go home and be safe at home. But if they can't be, what is our plan B? And to a family member that is saying, are you in a position to be able to care for this child for the length of the time that is required? And that could be up until they're 18 years old. So we need to start those thinkings right from the beginning. So our primary permanency goal, what needs to occur, who will do what by when, so that will be in the case plan and you know, that will be setting out for the birth parents what they need to do in order to have their children safely returned to their care. And then what is the alternate primary permanency goal? So what are the actions and steps that need to take place in respect to that, and who will do what by when? And through all of this, through all of the concurrent planning, what carers need to be really mindful of the importance of that connection with family throughout. Okay, we're moving on into our sections now, and we're looking at section 51V. And so what I spoke about earlier, pre-2018, was that there was already requirements under the Act to consider the long-term guardianship to Chief Executive as the last option, but that wasn't being achieved because most long-term guardianship orders were to the Chief Executive, and unfortunately still are. But there was some insertions of different pieces of legislation now that really ensure accountability in the sector, that children are not left in drift or left on long-term guardianship to CE orders, and that considered the end, that we don't need to look at that again. The child's on a long-term guardianship to CE, we've achieved legal permanency. We haven't achieved legal permanency. The Act now recognises that. So under section 51V, it requires that the Chief Executive must regularly review the case plan at least every 6 months. And following review of the plan, a report about the review must be completed under that section 54X. And when we go to that, first we'll go to 51VAA. So that was introduced in 2021 as well, in November 2021. And what it says is that the Chief Executive must review the case plan under section 51V within the period of 6 months, starting on the day that is 2 years after the day the long-term guardianship order was made. The review must comply with subsection 4. And so subsection 4 talks about the review must consider whether permanency for the child would be best achieved by an alternate care arrangement mentioned in 5BA. And so that's the preference around who should have guardianship. So basically what that is saying is if a child is on a long-term guardianship to CE order, then we have a responsibility to look, and if we haven't done it before that 2-year part, then definitely at the 2-year part we need to be looking at if the child is still on a CE order, long-term guardianship to CE, we need to bring our minds back to the preferences and would their permanency be best achieved through the making of one of those other orders. And to do that, the department is actually looking at who is the child placed with and is that a permanency option? And do we need to go down the road of actually doing a long-term guardianship or a permanent care order suitability assessment, because there are actual assessment processes that the department can undertake to determine suitability, and we'll talk about those as we go on. So then 51X says that there has to be a report about the review. So this section requires child safety to report on the review conducted under section 51V and 51 VAA. So this section outlines areas the report must include. So the report must include goals for best achieving permanency, remembering that permanency is achieved in its true sense when we have relational, physical and legal permanency. What has been achieved since the last case plan and what is yet to be achieved. So if we haven't achieved legal permanency, what were some of the things that were preventing that? And often what we see in this space is that the department are worried about whether the proposed guardian is able to maintain the level of contact without departmental intervention required of them with the birth family. So that can often be an area that's quite conflictual and can sometimes be an area where the department said, look, you know, the reason we need to take long-term guardianship is because we need to facilitate contact. So if that is the issue, if that is what is stopping a child from achieving permanency in its true sense, then there should be a plan as to what can be done to rectify that. The carer, the potential guardian needs to be spoken to about how they can facilitate contact in a safe and appropriate way and, you know, start to build evidence to demonstrate that they can do that. So that the idea is if the department exit out and this person, the suitable person is the guardian now, that we are satisfied they are going to be able to meet their obligations as a guardian, one of which is to maintain connection between the child and their family. So what has been done since the last case plan, and is there anything that still has not been achieved? If not, then what is our plan to deal with that? Because we don't want children remaining on long-term guardianship to the CE order. Changes to the goals. Do we need to change some of the goals? Who participated in the review and how, and what were the review findings? What would be the risks and benefits of returning the child to the care of the parent? So sometimes we have children in residential facilities, for example, that are on long-term guardianship to CE orders, and they could be now 13, 14 years old, and the reasons that they came into care could be very so they could have, for example, come into care because of neglect. Now that they're 13 and 14, they've maintained a relationship with their mum and dad that has been appropriate, and it may be that with support services in place, that 13 or 14-year-old could actually return home to the parents if, you know, the assessment from the department is deemed that the child wouldn't be at risk of significant harm if that was to take place. So the circumstances could have changed, and it's about always going back and having a fresh look at those, because it would be much better for a 13 or 14-year-old to be home with their mum and dad if it's safe to be so than in a residential facility on a long-term guardianship order to CE. Whether there is a real risk that permanency for the child will not be best achieved by returning the child to the care of the parent within a time frame appropriate to the child's age and circumstance, and progress made in planning for the alternate long-term arrangements under that 5BA4. Remember, 5BA4 lists the order of preference for long-term care. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to look at section 59. And this is around the making of the permanent care order. So remember, this is one of the alternate orders that was brought in 2018. And we're going to have a look at what that actually looks like. So the magistrate must consider when making this order that the person must be a suitable person for having guardianship of the child on a permanent basis. So the department has a suitability assessment around PCO, and they would provide that evidence to the magistrate as to what makes this person suitable. So in that, they would look at things such as their ability to meet their obligations as a permanent guardian under the Act, and that's around connection to family, around meeting the Charter of Rights for children, about, you know, that safe and consistent care, providing care in line with the Statement of Standards and legislative requirements. So committed to preserving identity, connection to culture of origin, and the child's relationship with members of the child's family in accordance with the case plan. And one of the things that I talk about here is what's really important is it's not about what a carer or a long-term carer guardian will do, it's about what they have done. So if you as a carer are considering that you want to be a long-term carer for children that are either in your care or may come into your care in the future, then it's not about coming to the point of guardianship and saying, yes, I will do this, I will connect the child to family, and I will make sure that I ensure that they have contact with siblings that are not in my care, and I will ensure that their day-to-day cultural community needs are met. What the department will be looking for, and what a magistrate will be looking for, and what the department's lawyers will be looking for, is evidence that you have done that right throughout the time that the child has been in your care. Because history predicts future, and so if that's stuff that you've already done, then the magistrate is going to have a position that if this is what you've been committed to in the past, then there's more likelihood that you'll go forward and do that in the future as well. Okay, and that the other consideration is that the child has been in the care of the proposed guardian under a CPO granting custody or guardianship of the child for at least 12 months. So that's not a requirement for long-term guardianship to suitable others to be granted, but it is a requirement for PCO. But there are exceptional circumstances, so 7B exists to state a magistrate can actually still make an order if not all those requirements are satisfied, but exceptional circumstances exist. So for example, if a carer was also already the permanent guardian of a child and then their newborn sibling came into care and the department considered it appropriate to go down that track of PCO straight away, then that would be considered an exceptional circumstance. Okay. So what is a permanent care order? Why does it differ? Why do we introduce it? What is different to a long-term guardianship order? So an order granting guardianship of a child to a suitable person other than the parent or the chief executive who is nominated by the chief executive. So that's really important. Long-term guardians and permanent guardians have to be nominated by the chief executive. You can't go and make those applications independently of the department. So a PCO can be varied or revoked only on application by DCPL. Now, DCPL stands for the Director of Child Protection Litigation. They are the department's lawyers that represent them in any children's court matters. So the first difference between a PCO and a long-term guardianship to suitable other, therefore, is that a long-term to suitable other order, a parent can actually make an application to revoke that in the children's court. But with a permanent care order, they actually can't do that. The only one that is able to make an application to revoke a PCO is DCPL. It doesn't legally sever that birth-parent relationship. So the importance of that ongoing connection and relationship still exists for any child on a PCO order. They must have been in the care of the proposed guardian for the 12 months prior. We just spoke about it. There's new permanent guardian assessment guidelines, so there is an assessment process to determine suitability. Initial case plan requirement and child guardian may request a review. So what that means is that at the time of making the order, there will be a case plan for the child, but unlike a long-term guardianship to suitable other, which is reviewed every 12 months, a PCO, when a child's on a PCO order, it won't be reviewed unless there is a request from the child, young person or permanent guardian to have that case plan reviewed. There is no requirement for child safety to have any ongoing contact with the child. So again, that's different to long-term guardianship to other because the department still do that case plan review every 12 months, so they have contact every 12 months. There is no obligation for the permanent guardians to allow child safety to have contact with the child. The child or guardian may at any time ask for a review of the case plan, so up here, and child safety may decide to refuse this request. However, this is a reviewable decision. So what that means is if a guardian or a young person requests a review of their case plan and the department say no, then that decision is actually reviewable in QCAT. I've not seen the department refuse to review a plan either for a long-term guardian or a permanent guardian. You know, obviously they want to support that continued arrangement, long-term arrangement, and so my experience is that they will absolutely review case plans. Okay, so we spoke earlier on about children being adrift, and we talked about that meaning that a child is on short-term order after short-term order, and then that was raised in the Carmody review as being an issue because it didn't achieve permanency for children. So as a result of that, one of the changes to the Child Protection Act was the duration of the Child Protection Order. So that was introduced in Section 62. So the total amount of short-term orders cannot exceed a period of 2 years. It takes effect from the time of the final order, not the interim. Now that's really important because you could have a child on 3 years of interim orders before a final order is made, because that final order may be being contested by a parent and it's just adjourned and adjourned and adjourned in court. So it's unfortunate and an unintended consequence of how the Act was done, but certainly that is the case. So it doesn't include that 2 years does not include the time that the child is on the interim order. Subsequent short-term orders can be applied for and made under exceptional circumstances. So what that tells us is up to 2 years, should not exceed 2 years, but could potentially, another order could be applied for under exceptional circumstances. So for example, that could be if a mother or father were in the last stages of reunification, it was going really well, maybe they got off to a rough start, so maybe it was a year into the 2-year order that, the parents started complying with the case plan, were up to overnights, but the department are just not satisfied at this point in time that it's okay for the child to go home full time. In that instance, they may apply for another 1-year order because they know reunification is on track. And, it could be that within 6 months of that 1-year order that the child will be home, and then the department can continue to monitor that child in that 6-month period that the order continues to be in place unless they make a decision to revoke. So it's not, creating a situation where we've nearly got a child home and the department are having to make a decision to either just, rush it or, go for a long-term order, that there has to be something in between that allows for those exceptional circumstances. So that is around that. I just want to actually just quickly talk in here about how it relates back to one of the general principles of the Child Protection Act, and that is 5BF. And what 5BF says is that the department have a responsibility when they remove a child from a parent's care to work with the parents towards case plan goals to have that child returned. So this really relates to the section here, and the reason it relates to that section is because when we are going to take a child off a mum or a dad or both, what that tells us is that they're in a place where they cannot provide care. So they're not likely to be in a good place. They could be affected by drugs and alcohol, by domestic and family violence, by mental health issues, by intellectual impairment. There's a range of reasons why our children and young people come into care. And we can't then expect, if it's bad enough that we're taking children in care, we can't then expect that the parents are just going to be able to do what they need to do on their own without support or assistance. So 5BF really supports the department's obligations to work with the parents towards reunification. In those first 6 months when a child comes into care, we typically see parents disengage, they're angry, they're hurt, they'll often hit rock bottom in that time. It's not a good space. And sometimes because of that, the department has tried to engage in those first 6 months and then, that engagement or those attempts of engagement may fall off. What 5BF tells us is that at no point, if the parents are disengaging, should the rest of the care team disengage. That it's up to the whole care team, the department, the family that are caring for the child, foster carers that are caring for the child, to actually work with the parents towards achieving reunification. And so prior to the Act changing and us having short-term orders at a limit, what was occurring is potentially 5BF was not being applied, and that we weren't consistently helping parents through the whole course of the short-term order to have their children successfully reunified. And so when it came to applying for a long-term guardianship order at the end of that short-term order, the magistrate wasn't able to grant that order because, in fact, the care team hadn't actually met the requirements under 5BF and worked consistently with the parents throughout the whole course of that 2-year order to have the children reunified. And what we also need to ensure is that the case plan requirements for parents are realistic. So if we're asking them to do parenting courses, they need to be available. If we're asking them to do drug and alcohol counselling, there needs to be availability. And those can be some of the things that obviously hold up reunification plans as well. So we all have a role to play in this. And what I'm going to do now is we're going to talk to Mel again from Infinity, because Mel's going to talk about the importance of this as well in terms of when we have carers that are actively working towards supporting birth parents to achieve reunification, the impact that that can have. So Mel, we've spoken a lot in the presentation about the importance of doing what we can to get our children home in the first instance. We don't want a whole lot of children on long-term orders, either to suitable other, to family, to the department. We want children home with their mums and dads wherever possible.
Absolutely.
And so we've talked about short-term orders, and we've talked about some changes in legislation back in 2018 that stated that orders can only be made for up to 2 years, and the importance of that 5BF principle where the department have a responsibility to work with families to get children back. I want to hear from you now in your experience working for Foster and Kinship Care Services and in the child protection sector for so long. What is the role of a carer, whether that be a kin carer or a foster carer, in those spaces of the short-term orders? Is it just up to the department to be working towards reunification?
Absolutely not. It's such an important role for the carer. Reunification is a difficult time for everybody. The parents want their children back, obviously. The carers struggle with some of the emotional fallout from the child, but they really need to be the adult there and buffer and scaffold that child's experience with reunification. What I see as a really great strategy is contact, facilitating contact, supporting contact, adding to the contact if they can. It's not enough just for a child to have a supervised visit with their parents once a week. A carer can be sending photos, can be facilitating phone calls. If a parent misses a contact, and there's lots of reasons why that might happen, making the visit up in some way, shape or form. If the parents are only available on the weekends and the department are happy with you seeing them on the weekend, try and make it happen. A child is torn between two families through this time. They love and desperately want to be home with their parents, but they feel guilty for any of that. So being able to help them navigate those emotions and show your support for the families is really important.
And you talked about connection and the importance of that, and I would imagine that if a carer does that well, I've heard lots of stories of where children have successfully been reunified and relationships with carers have been maintained post-reunification, that actually carers have become a big part of biological families' lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Not only as a support, but as friends. I've known a little girl that actually had her foster father walk down the aisle, and she'd been reunified for 10 years.
Wow, that's just amazing. So it just highlights the role that it is a care team effort. It's not just up to the department. And you raise the point of those divided loyalties and the importance of carers recognising how a child may be feeling and helping them to navigate those feelings, so that they're not feeling like they're choosing between two families, that there is enough love to go everywhere.
Absolutely, yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so now we are coming back to another section of the Act, section 74, which is the Chief Executive's obligations under particular orders. So the Chief Executive's obligations to children is to tell child about the Charter of Rights, to give written information about the Charter of Rights where appropriate, tell child about the obligations of the guardian, tell child about the public guardian and other entities known to the Chief Executive who can help a child if they consider that their guardian is not complying with their obligations, and to tell child about their right to contact child safety. So these are all the Chief Executive's obligations to a child or a young person where guardianship is being supported. This is all the information that they need to provide to them prior to that order being granted. And then we have the obligations of the guardian. So I've just spoken about what the Chief Executive's obligations are to the child. Now I'm going to talk to you about what the obligations of the long-term guardian or the permanent guardian to the child are. And again, it's about ensuring that those Charter of Rights are complied with. And so that makes up a big part of the suitability assessment, because obviously what I said before, if a carer has done that in the past, then they're more likely to do that in the future. So ensure the Charter of Rights is complied with as if the guardian was the Chief Executive and the child was in need of care and protection. Ensure the child is provided with appropriate help in transition to independence, or transition to adulthood, that should say, and preserve the child's identity in connection to their cultural origin. So that is their obligations, and there's some more here. So help maintain the child's relationship with the child's parents, family members, and other people of significance to the child. The obligations of the guardians must be met to the extent of it being in the best interest of the child. So the Children's Court can order any of these requirements do not apply, or apply with stated modifications, or apply to a stated extent if there is a risk to the child or family or not in the best interest of the child. So for example, if a decision had been made prior to the child going on a long-term order that there had been a restriction on contact, that one of the parents or both of the parents were not able to see the child, and those would only be under extreme circumstances. But if that decision had been made, then obviously if a long-term guardianship or a permanent guardianship order is being applied for, then the magistrate would actually, as part of making the order, consider that maintaining the child's relationships with those birth parents where contact has been restricted to none in the past is actually able to continue on, as it could place the child at risk or the carer household at risk. Those would only be in extreme circumstances, but what I'm saying is that the right for a child to achieve permanency should not be blocked by the fact that that requirement around obligations to support family contact, when in fact the department have made a decision that family contact is not in the best interest of the child for particular family members. There may be others that of course it is. Okay, so then section 59A. So we've talked about what a magistrate needs to consider when they are thinking about granting a long-term guardianship or a permanent care order, generally speaking, and now we're going to talk about what the specific special considerations are also applied when looking at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and the making of these orders. So section 59A, in deciding to make an order for a permanent care order for an Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander child, the Children's Court must have regard to Aboriginal tradition and island custom relating to the child placement principle in relation to the child. The court can only make the order if it is satisfied that the case plan for the child includes appropriate details about how the child's connection with his or her culture and community or language group will be developed and maintained, and that the decision has been made in consultation with the child if appropriate. The court may also have regards to the views of an independent Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person for the child or a member of the child's family. Okay, so we're going to take a closer look at that, and we're going to have the help of Angela from Kummara to do this and some discussions as well. So when we're thinking about the additional principles, we need to take a closer look. So a magistrate must consider the application of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principle and additional principles. So 5C talks about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people having the right to self-determination. So this has got to be something that the child wants, the young person wants, and what is the family's views and wishes in this, and not just mum and dad, but the wider extended family and community. And they must consider the long-term effect of a decision on the child's identity and connection with the child's family and community must be taken into account. So if we have family that are not supporting this, then the department really need to consider as to what impact that will have on the child or young person long term. And then in addition to that, we have the prevention, partnership, placement, participation and connection principles. And we're going to take a closer look at those. So Angela is going to discuss with us when a child and or young person is placed within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principle, that is, they're placed with a family member or with community, that actually the prevention, partnership, connection, participation and placement principles can sometimes be naturally achieved because they're placed within family, they're placed within community. And so the likelihood of these core principles actually being achieved naturally for a child or young person are of course much higher. So when we look at that prevention, the child is being brought up within the child's own family and community, so that is being achieved. Partnership, the child's family and community are actively involved in making significant decisions for the child because the child's part of their community, and so they're all just making those decisions naturally. Connection, of course that's natural. The child is naturally connected to family, community, culture, traditions and language because they're being brought up by family. Participation, the child and the child's families, parents and family members are participating and being able to participate in administrative and judicial processes relating to significant decisions about the child. So, for example, a parent is being supported to engage in decisions around contact. So when children are placed with family and family are part of those decisions naturally, they get to participate, not through a process that can be sometimes quite bureaucratic and red taped. It's actually happening much more naturally because the child is being raised within family. And then of course the placement principle is being adhered to because the child is in care and is placed with a family in accordance with the placement principle. So that is when a child is actually placed within family in accordance with the placement principle. Now, when a child is not placed in accordance with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander principle, this is where there needs to be that really concerted effort and intentional effort from foster carers to actually meet those core principles. And Angela's going to talk to us about what that can look like day to day as well. So some examples of how we may achieve that is prevention. Keep a child in the community that they know. If you're a foster carer and you want to provide long-term care to an Aboriginal child and they are within their community, you need to think about if you are making a decision to move out of that community, the impact that that will have on that child because they're actually being taken out of a community that they know. Partnership, recognising the importance of raising the child alongside the community. And so as a foster carer, again, you need to recognise that you're raising this child primarily in your home, but the community surrounding you needs to play a part in raising that child, and there'll be lots of people that are involved in making decisions for that child or young person. And again, so that comes to participation as well, recognising the right for family and community to be the key decision makers. It won't just be mum and dad. There'll be grandparents, there'll be aunties, there'll be uncles, there'll be many, many people that actually play a role in participating in the decisions that are affecting that child or young person. And so as a carer, caring for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, you need to absolutely be open to recognising that it will be a village raising this child. Connection, genuine connection to all family, not just birth parents, but extended family, and this being a natural process. You have to be open to that. And that the placement, supporting concurrent planning and transition of placement to family if located. So recognising that as a carer, if an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child is placed with you and you are non-Aboriginal, that there will be concurrent planning occurring and that the department has an obligation to continue to do family mapping to try and locate a family member. And in the case that a family member is located, actually transitioning and supporting the child transitioning to that family member in accordance with the placement principle. So Angela, when a child is placed either in accordance with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander principle or not, there is an expectation that the 5 core principles are met. When we are placing a child in accordance with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principle, I can imagine that those 5 core principles are again met much more naturally for a child.
Yes.
So can you give me an example around what participation would look like if a child was placed in accordance with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander principle with family?
So, like I just said before, participation starts from the beginning of the removal of a child, where child safety are having those conversations with the parents.
Yeah.
To, you know, explore family options for the children to be placed with them first.
Yeah.
And then the follow-up process would be to have the family participate in a family-led decision-making meeting where all family members have the opportunity to have their input and decisions being made in the best interests of the child without the influence of the department. It would be just the family making those decisions.
Absolutely, and that's more naturally achieved when a child is placed within family. Absolutely. What about connection? I can imagine that connection for a child placed within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander principle again would be natural, because you would have a child in community with family, and they would be seeing their aunties and their uncles and their grandparents and
And again, you know, like connection will be discussed in a family-led decision making on how they would continue to support the young persons to have that connection throughout the whole placement. Yeah.
So then, if we have a child that's not placed in accordance with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander principle, there is obviously still an expectation that those 5 core principles are met. It's not going to come naturally, is it?
No.
There has to be a concerted effort from the care team members to actually meet those. So if you're speaking to me, I'm a non-Aboriginal person and I'm caring for an Aboriginal child, how would I support something like participation?
I would think that when the child is firstly removed, that they need to continue to have those connections, whether it's been attending the same school, if they're involved in any sports programs and that, to continue that so that they have familiar surroundings and that sort of stuff.
And would there be an expectation from me that there is a lot of family members that I can expect that will be wanting to participate and have a right to participate in the decisions for the child that that I've got in my 24/7 care?
Yeah, definitely.
And so then if we look at connection, for example, I would again think that it's not going to come naturally. Who would I be expected to connect this child to?
I would hope that the family and their support agency, along with the CSO, have conversations and discuss what supports are available in their community.
Yeah.
And try to access as much support as they can for these young people.
Because it's connection, what you were saying before, Angela, if I can go back to that, connection's not just about with family, it's about with the community, it's about engaging them in programs to get that education that they need, that I'm not the right person to provide it to them.
That's right.
So non-Aboriginal carers that are putting their hand up to care for Aboriginal children need to think more broadly about what these participation is about, the participation of the community. Connection is about connection with community and family. It's much more broader than just the immediate family of that child.
And it's up to us Indigenous workers to give the carers the knowledge on what services are available for them.
So when considering permanent orders for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, child safety will bring their minds to the following additional considerations. So what long-term effect each option would have on the child's identity and connection with the child's family and community. The extent to which each option upholds the 5 elements of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principles, which we just spoke about. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principle, so is it in accordance with that, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander principle. The extent to which each option upholds the child's rights under the Human Rights Act 2019, and there's special consideration in the Human Rights Act around children having the right to be connected to their culture and language and community. And the principle that outlines that the preference for achieving permanency within the context of all statutory requirements and the child's specific permanency needs. There is the family participation programs and permanency decision making as well that will play a role in this. So the key function of the FPP is the facilitation of that independent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander family-led decision making, a process whereby authority is given to the parents, families and children to work together to solve problems and lead decision making in a culturally safe space, and that this program operates to keep children safe in a way that optimises a family's participation and confidence in the process while meeting any statutory obligations. They have a key role in working alongside families to facilitate family-led decisions regarding their children and ensuring that all decisions are reflective of the key principles. And Angela's going to have a discussion with us now around family-led decision-making and the FPP programs and how helpful that they can be in making decisions for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and supporting child safety's practice in that space. So family-led decision-making, we've got family participation programs that exist here in Queensland. Can you talk to us, Angela, about the role of the family participation programs for children and young people and their families?
So I would say for a lot of people that it's very confronting when a child is removed. So then child safety will refer the family to the family participation program to then have a family-led decision-making meeting, and these meetings are generally held in a culturally appropriate forum, and all issues are addressed with cultural sensitivity, and it allows for all family members to have an input, and then they're provided with feedback from the situation and what is needed to meet the child's need while they're in care. And so,
my background working in child safety in New Zealand around the family group conferencing and really placing responsibility on families to be coming up with the plans to keep their children safe, and this is what family-led decision making is all about.
And it gives them self-determination. They are the experts of their own family.
Yeah.
They know what each person can provide, so.
Absolutely.
For the child.
And if we hand over that responsibility to family, then the plans that they come up with, they're more likely to follow because they've been part of the solution.
Yeah, and from those family-led decision-making meetings, a cultural case plan is implemented from that meeting. Yeah.
I want to thank Angela for her time and helping us take a much deeper dive into what the considerations are for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, really thinking about those 5 core principles, what that means, what the purpose of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principle is in ensuring that our children are raised within family and community, and the importance of that concurrent planning and the role that FPP plays in all of that. So lots of considerations in that space. All children have the right to permanency. We need to ensure that when we are considering all children's rights for permanency, that we are ticking all the boxes and ensuring that their overall needs are going to be met in the permanent option that is available to them. Okay, we're now going to take a look at what each of the orders mean. So, This is a really good table to help you understand, and I reflected on it at the beginning. So a short-term order to or LTG to the chief executive, a long-term guardianship to another person, so that's either a foster carer or a kinship carer or a family member, and a permanent care order. So contact with the CSO will happen monthly, or should happen monthly here. It will happen yearly if you have a long-term guardianship order of a child, but there will be no contact if you have a PCO. Community visitor, yes, you'll have a community visitor in most situations if there's an LTG or LTG to CE, but you won't for LTG to other, and you won't for PCO. The case plan review, it's reviewed 6 monthly. Remember, if it's a long-term guardianship to CE, at that 6 monthly review, we should be looking at, are we still on the most appropriate order here? Could we be going to one of these? LTG to another person, it's 12 months or upon request. And then permanent care order, there's an initial one done, and that's only ever reviewed upon request by the child or young person or by the guardian. What about an education support plan? Yes, they're done if the department is a guardian or custodian, but no, they're not done otherwise. That's not to mean that their educational needs are not going to be met through the school. We obviously have individual education support plans that are available for all children, and so if there's still educational needs that are required to be met, then you can speak to the school about how that can be best achieved. Transition to adult plan. Yes, there will be one in the event that the child is subject to long-term guardianship to the CE, but no, not if you're the guardian for LTG or permanent care. And why? Because you are the parent, so you would actually support this child to transition to adulthood as you would if it was your own. Cultural support plans, yes. If it's LTG to CE, no. If LTG to other, the guardian is responsible for meeting those needs, and we've just gone into a really deep dive about what the expectation on that guardian would be to meet those needs. And so there should have been evidence throughout your time as a carer that you have been able to meet those needs and will continue to do so. And that's the same for a PCO order as well. Child health passport, yes here, no for long-term guardian to other, and no to permanent care order. NDIS plan, of course a child can have an NDIS plan, that's a federal plan, and that can go across all areas. If NDIS is here, the department or the guardian, so they're signing off on that plan and have the most say over it obviously, but if you become the guardian, then obviously you are the person that would be signing off on that and be responsible. Fortnightly caring allowance, you receive that regardless of what order that the child is on. High support needs allowance, you can obviously still get that if a child is on long-term guardianship to CE. You actually can continue to get high support needs allowance, and you can apply for it at any time as a long-term guardian. So even if you don't have it at the time that you take on long-term guardianship, if the child in your care and your guardianship needs increase, then you can actually request that. You would need to go through the same process as you would if the child was on LTG to CE. But with a PCO, there will only be consideration for emergent situations for up to 6 months. So it's not, there's no ability to have high support needs allowance under a PCO long term. Complex support needs allowance is the same. So yes here, you can apply for it even after the granting of a long-term guardianship order, but not with a permanent care order, again, only up to 6 months in exceptional circumstances. Child-related costs, yes here of course. Long-term guardianship to other, you can apply. There are policies and procedures that support the the chief executive being able to approve. But one of the things that's obviously taken into consideration as part of your long-term suitability assessment is your ability to financially meet the needs of the child long-term. And then a permanent care order, you're not able to apply for any additional child-related costs. Order expiry, short-term order is recorded on the order, so it expires on the 18th birthday. And with LTG to other expires on the 18th birthday. And the same for PCO, but what's important to know here, and it's important that we share this information because it can become a bit of a shock to people. Those orders only exist as long as the child is alive. If that child passes away or the young person passes away before their 18th birthday, then all of the rights and responsibilities actually revert back to the birth parents. And the reason for that is because there is no order in place anymore. The child's no longer in need of care and protection. And so laws in Queensland at the moment would mean that it would just go back to the birth parents. So again, it's really important that those relationships are maintained with birth parents throughout the childhood, so that in the tragic event that a child or young person would pass away, that we would hope that the birth family and the guardians can work together towards making funeral arrangements, etc. So revocation, so a parent and or DCPL can make an application to revoke. And that's the same here for LTG, but like I said earlier on, for a PCO order, it can only be DCPL. It cannot be a parent. Access to respite, yes, but no. No here and no here, and the reason for that is you are the parent. If you need a break, you would just do what any other parent would do, and you would access your family and community around you to have that night off. And that makes up part of the suitability assessment as well. So we'll talk about that as we go on. So when it becomes evident that a child or young person cannot be reunified with their parents, Child Safety must make an assessment and recommendation to DCPL as to the most appropriate long-term order. So what that means is that the department are not the decision makers. They do an assessment and they make a recommendation, but it's actually DCPL that are the decision makers in respect to what application is applied for. Now, typically what occurs is that the department will first consult with their lawyers, which is the Office of the Official Child and Family Solicitor, so OCFOS, and they are internal child safety lawyers, and so they'll give the department advice as to what they need to do more, potentially, for an assessment and recommendation, and then it will be presented to DCPL, and DCPL will make the final decision as to whether that order has been granted. That is important, because if the department are not able to evidence that they have worked in accordance with, remember, that 5BF principle, which is around the importance of working with the family throughout the whole entire course of that short-term order, that it may be that a magistrate won't even consider long-term guardianship because there is no evidence to support actually that the parent is not able to meet the child's long-term needs because they haven't been given the opportunity to do that. So that's DCPL's role. Okay, so these are the things, if you are thinking that you want to be a guardian for a child in your care, these are the things that the department will consider in a suitability assessment, either under a long-term guardianship suitability assessment or a PCO. They'll look at the placement length and stability. They'll look at the attachment history. They'll look at the standard of care history. They'll look at the ability to meet the Charter of Rights. So what is the evidence that you've done that? The financial stability, relationship with family, and ability to meet specific cultural and religious needs. They'll look at the ability to maintain family connections, ability to meet the child's needs without the additional sources of support usually offered to carers. So, for example, it could be working really well at the moment because you've got respite, you've got an education support planning, you've got foster and kinship care agency involvement, you've got all these things in, so it could be stable. But what the department needs to consider is if we take all those things out, if there's no education support plan in place, if the agency are not visiting and providing support, if respite care is not in place and you don't have an alternative, will this placement still work? So that's what they need to look at. What are the children's views and wishes, obviously, and what are the parents' views and wishes? So the assessment have formalised assessment guidelines that must be completed by Child Safety to assess that suitability, and that will be presented to the magistrate. This assessment will assist Child Safety to form their recommendation to DCPL, and DCPL will then make a decision as to what order will be applied for. So carers may not agree with the order being applied for by DCPL, and so in these instances, in the first instance, if you don't agree, so if the department are seeking a long-term guardianship to CE order and you believe that you're a suitable person to provide care, let's say the department have undertaken that assessment and they don't deem you suitable, you can actually make an application to be heard in respect to the matter. So you can actually make an application as a carer to join as what's called a non-party to the proceedings under Section 113 of the Child Protection Act. And what that allows is for you to put submissions through to the magistrate which supports your view that you are a suitable person to be a guardian. So court may hear submissions from non-party in a proceeding on an application for an order for a child. They may hear submissions from the following persons: a member of the child's family or anyone else the court considers is able to inform it on any matters relating to the proceedings. We never used to see carers really join under Section 113, but we're definitely seeing an increase in that over the last few years. QFKC has our legal service, which is able to provide free legal advice to carers in these circumstances and advise you on how to make that application and support you to do that. And our QFKC case officers are also really knowledgeable in that area as well and can point you in the right direction of the forms that you would need to fill out to undertake that. But first, like I said, always speak to your CSO, your team leader and the manager in the first instance. And of course, at times we're going to agree to disagree on what we think is in the best interest of children, and that's where we're really lucky in Queensland that there is options for carers to be heard independently. Okay, review of case plans. LTG to other has a 12-month review. LTG to other can request review at any time, and PCO only has the case plan review on request. We've already spoken about that. Short-term intervention can be put in place. So when I said you can request a case plan review, you might have all of a sudden that 14-year-old that is going through the transition of being a teenager, and any transition of being a teenager can be a difficult time, but particularly our children and young people that have experienced harm. And obviously that developmental milestone has a lot to do with identity. And what we know is that trauma really affects that, and a child being displaced from family can really have an impact on them. And so it can be a time we see at QFKC where carers or guardians are reaching out to us because they are experiencing issues. Our advice to you is call us sooner rather than later, not when it's at that drastic point, so that we can support you to request a case plan review with the department. And, you know, there are certainly things that can be put in place. There could be additional financial assistance, training and education, family contact assistance, assistance with advocacy in relation to government bodies, and potentially even emergency respite. So really important to understand that. Review of case plans can be achieved through a simple review of the case plan, and additional assistance can be requested where policy and procedure allows for this. So just under the reviewable rights, so if you have long-term guardianship to other, the child or parent or guardian may request a review of the case plan. We've spoken about that. And for a PCO, they may request a review of the case plan. If they refuse these requests, the case plan due to the child's circumstances not being significantly changed in their view, or if it would be inappropriate in the circumstances, so they may refuse the request to review the case plan based on those, and the decision to refuse to review the case plan under Section 51 VA and VB is a reviewable decision that can go to QCAT. Okay, so this is just briefly talking about PCO complaints. So like I said, a parent is not able to make an application to revoke a permanent care order, but what they can do is when they don't think that a permanent guardian is meeting their obligations under the Act, they can make a complaint to the department. So the complaint is received that the guardian is not complying with Section 79A. Remember that Section 79A is what the obligations is under a PCO. So the department can investigate the complaint. They may say that the child has been harmed and the guardian is not willing and able to protect, or guardian is not complying with 79A. So there could be an application to the court to vary or revoke the PCO. The guardian is complying with Section 79A, so there's no change to the PCO. And then the complainant will be given review options to either go to the complaints unit, so that's the Department Central Complaints Unit, or the Ombudsman. But the department can also refuse to deal with the complaint. So that could be if the parent continuously makes complaints and the department have reviewed them and there is been no concerns raised, so they may think that the concerns or the complaints are vexatious in nature, so they can make a decision not to deal with a complaint. And if they make a decision not to deal with a complaint, the parent is able to actually apply to QCAP to have the decision reviewed, not to deal with a complaint. So QCAP will not actually investigate the complaint. Their role would be to look as to whether the department should be reviewing that. Okay, we have looked at a lot of information today. We've had the help of Infinity and Kummara today, which has been really helpful in terms of taking a deep dive into some of those areas of permanency. We need to think that the frameworks underpinning permanency decision making now is recognised in legislation, and this will ensure that children achieve permanency in its real sense. It's really exciting. Like I said at the very beginning, every child deserves someone that is irrationally crazy about them. And if we had a rational crazy person for every single person in alternate care, then our life outcomes for our children and young people would be so much better. It is critical that safety and support networks surrounding children continue to bring their mind to these frameworks when making decisions relating to permanency. And remember that permanency is not just about placement. Remember that the last person to have guardianship of a child is the chief executive, because we want those irrational, crazy people making the guardianship decisions for our children and young people. Carers are a critical member of safety and support networks in achieving permanency for children and young people, be that with parents, extended family or themselves. You as carers play a critical role in having our children reunified to mums and dads where at all possible. We really need to look at that as the primary goal of permanency for our children and young people, so that children and young people that are not able to be home with their mums and dads are the ones that we're able to find long-term placements for, either with family or with foster carers. So let this be the start of something new in Queensland where children do not drift, where concurrent planning leads to solid decision-making that is focused on the best interests of children, not only now, but for the rest of their life. And just finally, we need to consider that a goal without a plan of execution and a deadline will just stay a goal. If we don't have plans, we may think we want something to happen, but if we don't have a plan about how we're going to achieve that, it will just continue to be a goal and our children will remain in drift. Here's all our contact numbers. I hope that you enjoyed that presentation today. For any specific casework advice, if you have a matter that you would like to discuss with QFKC, please contact our office on the 3256 6166, and we have 6 case officers across Queensland that will be able to help you with your inquiry. I thank you for your time.